All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Oleas. I work with the Contra Costa Family Justice Center. I hope you're in the right spot. This is our Family Justice Institute training. When we started our Family Justice Center, we felt it was really important to have experts and specialists be able to give information about their topic of expertise. I'm fortunate enough to be able to talk to you today about Interpersonal Violence 101. It is a very rough overview. If you're interested in more information, going in depth a little bit more, please feel free to look at our YouTube page. It's Coco Family Justice. If you just do the little search bar at the top of YouTube, you're welcome to see all of our trainings. We offer them totally free for folks. We want to be able to share as much knowledge as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slides here. What I'll do is two things just to let folks know. We will be sending out these slides after the presentation. You will get a copy of them. You're welcome to follow up with me with any questions you have. I'm going to hold questions until the end, if that's okay, just to keep things moving fluidly. And then obviously, if there are questions that come up, happy to answer those. We are in a webinar format because we're a pretty large group this morning, which is fantastic. But that just means we did have to do a webinar, so you won't be able to come on screen. But I can promote folks who are interested when they're asking questions later in our workshop. All right, so you already know who I am. Let's keep going. All right, so the goals for this training today, we're going to broadly define what interpersonal violence is. So that means domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, and human trafficking and stalking. We're going to be able to identify safety risks, including those using a lethality assessment, strangulation, and possible protective factors for survivors. We're also going to introduce a little bit of a public health approach as a means of preventing interpersonal violence. And last but not least, we're going to briefly touch on ACEs, which I'm sure the majority of you are already familiar with, and the impact that trauma can have on children. So a lot to cover in this one workshop. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about trauma before we start going into definitions and all of that, because at the heart of this, interpersonal violence is somebody having experienced a type of trauma. They're in a crisis state. And what tends to happen with folks that have experienced a trauma, and I'm not a medical physician, so please don't take too much to heart in my explanation, but when somebody is in a traumatic situation, so I tell folks, think of it like you were in a fender bender. Nobody got hurt. It just jostled you. Your adrenaline's going, you're getting out of the car. You're going to have to exchange phone numbers, all that. And I want you to think about what if at that same point or right after that, somebody came up to you and gave you a great big envelope with a bunch of different phone numbers to call saying, you should call all of these numbers because it's going to give you the resources you need for fender benders and what happened, mechanics, police department phone number, all that stuff. How likely is it that you're going to process that information at all? It's not, right? You're in a state of your adrenaline's going, you're in a fight or flight mode because of what has just happened. So you being able to process information in a logical sequence is physiologically not possible. And so I want to show what is actually happening in your brain when somebody experiences trauma. So when they experience trauma, the prefrontal cortex, this front part of your brain, the closest to your forehead, that it controls your thought process, linear thinking, being able to put something in a chronological order, rationale, all of those things. When you've experienced a crisis or a traumatic situation, that kind of stops working. Obviously, it doesn't shut down all the way, but it kind of takes a back seat because this little tiny section right here called the amygdala in the middle of our brain, that's what's called our reptilian brain. And what that is it triggers our fight, flight, or freeze mode because we become in survival mode because we're creatures, right? And so the initial instinct is when we're dealing with a trauma, we say, okay, I'm in a traumatic situation. What do I need to do to make sure I stay alive and I stay as safe as possible? And so oftentimes working with survivors of trauma who I know a whole majority of you have, they can have a really hard time remembering details about what's happened to them. They can have a really hard time being able to say, okay, first this happened, then this happened, then this happened. They usually can't do that. And this is the physiological reason as to why they can't do that. So what ends up happening though is that what that manifests into is sometimes they forget that there's appointments that they need to go to. Sometimes if you're filling out a restraining order for somebody, they're not going to be able to give you a lot of details because they were in a crisis mode. They don't remember everything that happened. And so that can be really frustrating both for the person that has gone through that experience, but also for advocates who are working with those survivors or direct service providers who are needing that information to get them the help that they need. So later in this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about how to interact with folks in a way that can get them the support that they need, given what has happened to them. So we start off, obviously, by asking, what is interpersonal violence? So in the definition of interpersonal violence includes domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, human trafficking, and stalking. I am going to be touching on all of these topics today. I'm not going to be giving case examples. I think a lot of you already have been doing this work for a while, so you're familiar with these concepts. We're just going to focus more on details, some data, things like that. But obviously, if something is triggering or comes up for you, please feel free to just take a break for a minute and come back to us. Okay, we're going to start by talking about domestic violence. I would say that the majority of the clients we see at the Family Justice Center here in Contra Costa County and in Solano County are domestic violence survivors, about 70% of our clientele. So domestic violence is defined as abuse in intimate relationships that are a pattern of coercive behavior designed to exert power and control over individuals. So in an intimate relationship, what we're referring to is all of these different things. So, and the Welfare and Institution Code actually gives a broader definition, because when people usually think of intimate relationships, they usually think of a partner, a husband or wife, a spouse, somebody you're dating, maybe a child, but it's actually a little bit broader than that. So obviously it can include a spouse, former spouse. It can include current former dating partner, somebody you were engaged to. It can include a co-parent. It can include a child of either of those individuals, or it can include another relative within the first or second degree. So that means thinking about a grandparent, because you're one away, you're related by one person away from that person. A grandchild counts. What also can be included is close relatives that you may live with as well. And I always say cohabitant or former cohabitant, because this gets the most confusing. And it's usually during restraining order applications. Folks say, oh, I have a roommate that I've been having so many problems with, I want to get a restraining order against them. Cohabitant in this context with domestic violence specifically relates to somebody that you have a closer relationship to than somebody that you just happen to also pay rent for the same space with. So it could be you were on their health care, you shared a bank account, you were domestic partners. It always means some type of dating or familial relationship, not just a roommate or a neighbor that you're living with, and something might be going on. How many folks can you like either raise your hand or in the chat Say, how many folks have seen the power and control wheel? Wonderful. I'm getting a whole lot of hand raises. This is great. So you all know that the power and control wheel is really a visual that can be used to explain different types of abuse that can happen within relationships. So at the core, right at the center, all of these areas, all of these types of violence that can be experienced, the main thing is that they're all about exerting power and control over somebody else. So it can be physical violence, it can be sexual violence. I think 100% of the clients that we see have experienced some type of emotional or verbal abuse. It can also be financial abuse. We've seen where co-parents, where one parent is using a child to relay messages to another parent. So manipulation of children as well is something we see often. But any of those are really about power and control over somebody else. This is a great resource, by the way, for those of you that work with survivors, and that they're very visual people to sort of understand the concepts. This is a great thing. If you just Google power and control wheel, it'll pop right up. It's a wonderful resource to have. So in a domestic violence relationship, what tends to happen is there's a cycle that occurs. So typically at the start of a new relationship, you have what's called the honeymoon phase. Things are good, you know, you're happy, maybe you're just starting out dating one another, things are going okay. And then there's a little bit of a tension building phase that happens in domestic violence relationships. So somebody gets irritated a lot. They put you down for something that you've done, you know, things like that. Eventually, that tension builds up, if there's enough of that, into an explosion. So it can be a physical assault that happens, it can be a sexual assault that occurs, a very severe threat of physical violence. And immediately after that, what happens is you go back into a honeymoon phase. And usually what that looks like is the person that caused the harm is really sorry for what they've done. They apologize, you know, they're having a bad day, they were having a bad week at work. They want to get help, they're gonna reach out to somebody to try and get some support. All of those things are promised. In domestic violence relationships, though, the only way to break this cycle is for somebody to change their behavior. If neither person's behavior changes, this cycle is going to continue and continue and continue. And by changing behavior, what I mean is somebody leaves the relationship, so that breaks the relationship. Somebody or both parties end up going to counseling, perhaps, and really work on their whatever is going on for them. Maybe it's been a previous trauma that they're trying to deal with or cope with. But until somebody makes that break in the relationship cycle, this is going to continue and continue. And what we see very often is in high risk cases of domestic violence where physical harm and or even a homicide may happen, there's no honeymoon phase anymore. It's either tension building or explosion, tension building, explosion. That sorry period, that things are okay right now period, that goes away. And again, until one of those individuals in the relationship stops that cycle somehow, it's going to just continue and continue. So a little bit about statistics. How often does domestic violence happen between partners? We all know that there are significantly more instances of domestic violence than what get reported. So this is a national average. It's about 1 in 3 women and about 1 in 4 men. But that being said, I wouldn't be surprised if those numbers were actually higher, because we don't capture every single instance of domestic violence that occurs within a relationship. For the LGBT community, it's even higher rates of abuse that are experienced. And sometimes people get really surprised by that. But about 60% of bisexual women have experienced domestic violence compared to heterosexual women. About 66% of lesbians reported at least one DV experience, and about 14% of gay men reported at least one domestic violence experience. So within the LGBT community, that likelihood is increased, unfortunately. On average, it takes a woman about 7 times in attempting to leave their relationship before they actually complete leaving the relationship. And a lot of times people ask, well, why does it take that long? Or why is it so hard to break that cycle of abuse? And this is just a very small list. There's lots of individual reasons, but it could be a lack of options, support. In the Bay Area, for those of you, I mean, really, most of you are in California, we know that the cost of living is so significantly high. And so a lot of times what we see from our clients is they want to be able to leave the relationship. They know it's dangerous. They know they don't want to be experiencing it anymore. And they can't, because they can't afford to be living in a 1-income household when they've been living in a 2-income household. Especially if they have children they have to support. It is almost impossible for a 1-income household to be able to sustain on their own. And that's a lot of times what we see are folks that are they're in these relationships because that is the only option they have financially. Denial of how severe the abuse is also very common because it becomes natural to you. It's your everyday, right? You're experiencing this every day. So you may become numb to some of the things that are happening. And obviously threats to harm, isolation, threats of revealing immigration status, maybe if somebody's undocumented, all of these things, it can explain as to why somebody doesn't exit a relationship. For those of you that are outside of Contra Costa, I encourage you to look up these statistics. I got them from the Department of Justice. They have all of this data. For Contra Costa specifically, in 2023, there were about 3,200 domestic violence police reports made by the 26 law enforcement agencies in Contra Costa County. And again, we know, just to let you know with these statistics, that's a completed police report. That's not a call history. Whenever somebody calls 911 and police respond, that's called a call history. If the police then take down information and follow up and write a report, which is what this is referring to, that is considered a completed police report. So there will be times where police will respond out to a call and they won't write a report. They'll just respond and take care of the incident and move on their way. So this is not reflective of the number of calls police departments get. This is the number of reports that were written by officers or detectives. I do want to talk about domestic violence and firearms and the realities of having access to firearms within DV relationships. In Contra Costa County, about 50% of the domestic violence homicides that we've had are caused by guns. In 46% of mass shootings that we see throughout the country between 2015 and 2022, the perpetrator shot a current or former intimate partner or family member as a part of the mass shooting incident that occurred. And what I'm sure you've also heard is that domestic violence calls for police are one of the most dangerous calls that they can respond to. And partly because emotions are so high, right? And if somebody has a firearm within the household, that makes that relationship even more volatile potentially and more deadly. I want to share this resource with you all. I think it was 2022, the state legislature passed a bill called SB 320. And what it talks about is if somebody is the recipient, the receiving end of a restraining order, You have 48 hours to turn in a firearm if you are the recipient of that restraining order, and that's mandated by the court. You have to fill out paperwork saying you have turned in your firearm to either a licensed gun shop, to law enforcement, somebody who can verify that, yes, they have received your firearm, and you have to submit that paperwork to the court. If that paperwork is not filled out and submitted to the court within 48 hours, the court turns over that information to the district attorney's office. And this is in every county in California. The district attorney has the right to file a restraining order violation against that person. And what we saw is that many people, regardless of where they filed for a restraining order, they're the victim, or they're the recipient, they're the person that has potentially caused harm in that relationship. No one has been aware of these requirements and how stringent they are. And so we've created what we tried to, as neutral a platform as possible, to give information on how to go about filling out that paperwork and turning in that information. So it has information about for survivors who are trying to get the restraining order, that we put that information, and it's for restrained parties. We put that information as well, because we want to make sure people are aware that turning in your a firearm is a part of your restraining order that you have to abide by. There's also another legislative act that happened, and this was in 2019, so this was a while ago. I want to say it's 1441, but I might be wrong on that. But what it required is every county, every law enforcement agency within every county in California has to be aware and trained on a danger assessment tool of some kind. So they implemented this, right? They said, legislature said, yes, you have to do this, right? And then you have to be able to implement that, which is really hard, especially if there's no funding attached to that legislation. So in Contra Costa County, we use a danger assessment that's called the Lethality Assessment Program, or LAP. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. It was created by the Maryland Network on Domestic Violence and Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. And basically, it's an evidence-based homicide prevention tool to use. It has 11 questions that are either administered by law enforcement, by domestic violence advocates, by somebody who is able to go through those questions. They're yes or no questions. They ask about, do you have access to weapons? Do the person that's harmed, do you have access to weapons in the house? Have you ever been choked or strangled in your relationship? Has the person threatened to harm themselves or you? It's questions like that. Depending on how you answer those, you get a score. And you can score as high danger, which means you've answered enough yes questions that you are at risk of being killed by your partner. Remember, it's a homicide prevention tool. It's not a re-assault prevention tool. It doesn't dictate, or it doesn't try and prevent if you are going to be assaulted again in a relationship. It's, are you likely to be killed in that relationship? And if that person scores high danger, law enforcement and domestic violence advocates in our county immediately get in contact with that survivor and try and figure out safety plans. They may need to come into shelter. They may need to get signed up with some other benefits of some kind. But immediate action takes place because of the severity of the abuse that somebody's experiencing. There are other danger assessment tools that I know different counties in California are using. The hope is that you are using something. It doesn't have to be LAP, but that your agency or agencies that you partner with are using something, because this is a key tool. And the reason for that is because the people that, there was a study done by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell that looked at the domestic violence homicides that occurred within a given year, the homicides that happened, there had been law enforcement contact by 50% of those parties prior to the homicide happening. However, there had only been 4% of those parties that had been in touch with a DV agency of some kind getting resources. And so this tool really works to partner with law enforcement agencies and domestic violence advocates in trying to make those connections happen in a faster way. Because the theory is that if you're connected to a DV agency, the risk of you being killed by your partner goes down. That's the goal. Lethality assessment protocol really focuses on strangulation. We always use the word choking. Most victims do not say strangulation, that they've been strangled by their partner. They usually say, I was choked by my partner. And because of one study that showed the odds of becoming an attempted homicide victim increased by 700%. If you had been strangled in your relationship, your likelihood of being killed by that person increased significantly. And so what we've done is in Contra Costa, we've actually created a strangulation protocol for law enforcement, for medical facilities, for DV agencies. We're all going to follow the same protocol, give the same information to clients so that they can get the medical appointments or exams done appropriately, because if you've been strangled, you lose blood flow to your brain. You lose oxygen to your brain. If that happens for long enough, you are at risk of having a stroke. And so we want individuals that have recently been strangled to immediately be seen by medical personnel, because we want to make sure there's nothing in there that's going to cause you to have a stroke. So just to keep that in mind, it's a really important cause that we've worked very hard for the past 5 years in our county. All right, I'm going to move on to talking about child abuse. I know there were a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to try and go through them really quickly. But one of the questions I know has been, will you be getting a copy of these slides? Yes, you will. They'll either be emailed out later today or on Monday. I'm not sure what day. I know another question for the lethality assessment tool specifically, or danger assessment tools. You can find it online if you Google lethality assessment protocol. It should pop up. The tool itself is a little bit tricky to find, but what'll happen is that the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, their site will come up and can go into much more history and detail about the LAP. In order to be an administering site for the lethality assessment, you actually have to be connected to Maryland Network and go through a training with them on how to administer the questions. But at least you could get an idea of what the questions are just via Google search really quickly. Oh, there was another question about, does a recipient get their firearm back once the restraining order is lifted? They do not. Police don't do a service of receipt getting the firearm back. Once you turn it in, you turn it in. That's what it is. Great questions. Okay, so we're going to go into child abuse. So the definition of child abuse is when a person is inflicting the following on somebody under the age of 18 years old. It can be a physical injury, it can be a sexual assault of some kind or exploitation, willful harming or injuring in some way of a child, or what's also included in this category is neglect, because a caregiver, a guardian, has a duty to care for and provide basic has to be able to have access to food, has to have clothes, have to have a roof over your head. If you don't have these things, that can be considered neglect of a child. What we do know is that children witnessing domestic violence, even if they're not the recipient of the violence, if they just witness the violence, can suffer severe emotional and developmental difficulties, similar to children that have been the recipient of the abuse of some kind. So a lot of people come to the center and they say, we'll ask them, were their children present when an incident occurred? And they'll say yes, but they were in the other room, so they didn't hear anything. That is not true. Children hear everything. Even if it's a baby, they can absorb what's going on. They know what raised voices sound like. They may not actually visually see what's occurring, but they're aware of what's going on. And I think that's why children, even just witnessing or being in the other room when domestic violence is happening, can have the same impact as being the direct victim. So if they are a witness, if they're not the direct recipient of abuse, these are the types of things that they can see or that can happen. So for example, being in a home where abuse is happening means they're living in a constant state of, I'm not safe in my home. Something could happen to me. And you're in a constant crisis state or a trauma state. And remember, we talked about earlier, when you're in that state, you're not always able to develop or think clearly. So, and especially related to children, they have such growing, developing brains. If they're in a state of, I'm scared, I don't know what's going to happen when I get home, that impacts their development. That impacts their ability to absorb information from school. It impacts every aspect of their life. To give an idea of the severity of the abuse that occurs in Contra Costa County, at least, there are about 713 referrals that are made to Children and Family Services on a monthly basis. So these can be duplicated numbers, and the reason for that is because, say a child talks to a crisis counselor at school, and then the counselor or mom or dad takes that child then to their primary care physician, and they disclose abuse as well. Both of those parties are mandated reporters that have to turn in reports to Children and Family Services, but it's about the same incident or same child, but it's still a significant number of referrals that they're seeing on a monthly basis. This kind of leads us into a discussion around adverse childhood experiences. This I'm going over very, very briefly. So there are lots of wonderful trainings online about adverse childhood experiences. I highly recommend, if you are not familiar with them, to take a look at them, because it really explains what happens when children experience some types of abuse. So the 3 types of child ACEs included are abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual; neglect of some kind, physical or emotional; or as a child, they have somehow experienced a household dysfunction. So somebody in your home has mental illness that isn't treated. Somebody in your home was incarcerated, or a relative had been incarcerated. A mother treated violently in the home. There was substance abuse, or you experienced a separation or divorce within your home. And what we know is the more of these factors that children experience, the more likely they have medical outcomes later in life that are severe. So more impacts on their physical health, their mental health, addictions, being able to work in a work environment, and can lead to premature death. The good thing about ACEs is they can be counteracted, which, how often can we actually say, if there's a trauma that you've experienced in your life, there are ways to survive and recover from those. So these are resilience factors that can happen. What it's found is, if you have experienced several ACEs in your life, having close relationships that are healthy with caring adults can help mitigate some of those poor health outcomes that we see later in life. A caregiver that is knowledgeable and uses the power of positive parenting, the individual having a sense of purpose, there's hope. They have a wonderful connection with their faith community, or just their community in general. They have the ability to engage in positive social interaction, and they have support that are in place with either their family, their friends, something that gives them that ability to have the resilience that they so desperately need. Okay. Again, that was a very brief overview. There's, hours-long trainings on ACEs that I highly encourage you to watch, because there's that direct causal link to the more traumas you have experienced as a child, the worse your health outcomes are as you get older. Okay, human trafficking. So human trafficking occurs when somebody deprives or violates the personal liberty of another with the intent, there has to be intention, to obtain forced labor or services. This definition does not mean somebody has to cross a border, a country border, or use physical force in holding somebody captive, in depriving their liberty or their personal rights. So human trafficking, when we talk about human trafficking, we really focus on two different categories. Labor trafficking, which is actually less known. There's less knowledge around labor trafficking. I know in Contra Costa County, we have a human trafficking task force that really aims to try and raise awareness around what labor trafficking looks like, especially for law enforcement. They're familiar with what sex trafficking looks like. That they know what that looks like. They know how to identify that. Labor trafficking is much harder. So labor trafficking we often see in domestic work, janitorial work of some kind, in caregiving, in restaurants, in massage businesses. This is where we can see labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is really about depriving somebody the liberty. You don't pay them for the work that they're doing, and you're depriving them of something. Right? Because look, in that definition, you're depriving them or violating the personal liberty of another individual. So this sometimes can look like somebody working within your home that's required to work 14 hours a day, that then lives in your home and gets paid unreasonable wages. It can be doing other things that you're not getting paid for, or that some of your documents are being withheld and that you have to complete certain things in order to get your documents, like your passport, a social security card, whatever that might look like. Sex trafficking, we're more familiar with, right? We see that more in documentaries and in movies and things like that. But usually where we see sex trafficking happening most is through social media. It's really big in social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, in adult entertainment and strip clubs, in hotels and motels. And we also see, unfortunately, that foster youth that are in group homes, they're at more risk of being sex trafficked. And that specifically, if somebody's under the age of 18 years old, it's actually called commercially sexually exploited child or youth. So it's either CSEC or CSA. You may have heard of that acronym before. And this is someone who is under the age of 18, who is trafficked sexually or receives food or necessary things to survive, and is paid to perform sexual acts, and whose guardian was unable to protect that child. In Contra Costa County in 2023, Contra Costa partner agencies, our Rape Crisis Center, Community Violence Solutions, our Human Trafficking Task Force, the Family Justice Center, we've identified about 555 human trafficking survivors. This number is significantly lower than the amount of human trafficking that is happening within Contra Costa County and within the Bay Area. I am positive. Human trafficking is really hard to identify. You don't have survivors coming into an agency going, I'm being abused, I'm being trafficked. That never happens. What usually happens is they come in, at least at the Family Justice Center. Our Rape Crisis Center might have something different, but the Family Justice Center, somebody's coming in and saying, I'm in an abusive relationship. And when you start to have a conversation with that person, you start to realize they don't have access to their own phone. They don't have access to their own documents. They're made to do things that make them uncomfortable that they don't want to be doing. And it starts to sound more and more like there's trafficking happening than necessarily a domestic violence relationship. Of those 555 survivors identified, 132, so almost a quarter, were identified as being under the age of 18 years old. For CSEC youth, CSA, these numbers increase when they have more ACEs. So some of these can include, if they're involved in the juvenile justice system, the likelihood of them being trafficked goes up. If they're involved in the child welfare system, if they're in a foster home, a group home, the likelihood of them getting trafficked increases significantly. I'm not going to read through all of these, but just to get an idea of some of the key indicators of human trafficking, how do you identify it? There's a lot of crossover between sex and labor trafficking. Again, you're not able to speak on your own behalf. Your movements are very monitored or restricted. And then obviously within sex trafficking, there's branding or tattoos that can happen by the exploiter. Somebody can have what we see a lot in CSEC youth is they have a lot of very expensive items and they may not have a job. So you're kind of going, how are you getting these items? You know, purses or clothing or things like that. That's an identifier. Similarly, in labor trafficking, if they're not in control of their own finances, their own money, they owe a very large debt, and that debt is in exchange for their own personal documents. They don't have control over those. These are some of the indicators that you might see. All right. We're going to move into definitions of rape and sexual assault. So rape is sexual intercourse without consent. There is no consent legally. The definition of not being able to give consent includes when somebody lacks the capacity to give their consent. Somebody can't resist because they're intoxicated or under the influence of a substance of some kind. They're unaware or unconscious the act is occurring, and they consent because they're in fear of somehow. There's a threat that is made against them and they have to consent. Or in the state of California, this is different in each state in the United States, but in California, if you are under the age of 18, you legally cannot consent to sex. Blanket. Doesn't matter how consenting the two minors are. If you're under 18, you cannot consent to sex. In some other states, I know the age is 16, so it kind of varies state by state. But for California, the age is 18 years old. The Rape and Incest National Network gives statistics that about 1 in every 6 women and 1 in every 33 men have either experienced an attempted or completed rape within their lifetime. Again, I think these numbers could be higher because not every rape or sexual assault is reported. In Contra Costa County, again, we're going to look at police reports completed. There were about 282 rape police reports that were reported. You can, again, with the Department of Justice, you can find these numbers for any county within California. So you're able to look up the numbers and see the sort of the trends that are happening. Sexual assault is a broader category than rape. So I always tell people, think of sexual assault as like this circle, and then think of rape as like this circle within sexual assault. Sexual assault is a wider definition. It can include sexual intercourse, but it can also include sodomy, oral copulation, sexual penetration, sexual touching against somebody's will. And you're doing that through force, violence, duress, menace, fear, some reason that the person is not consenting to that act, that encompasses sexual assault. What we also know is that the likelihood of somebody suffering suicidal or depressive thoughts after a sexual assault or rape has occurred increases significantly. So 94% of women who are raped experience symptoms of PTSD within the first 2 weeks of following the incident that took place. Those symptoms, 30% of women continued experiencing PTSD 9 months after the rape occurred. What we also know is that about a third of women who are raped contemplate suicide, and 13% of women that have been raped have actually attempted to kill themselves. So I know I'm brushing through all of these. Again, there are wonderful resources on the Rape and Incest National Network website, on the Family Justice Center YouTube page. We talk a little bit more about each category. We have a human trafficking training specifically that's a couple hours, rape and sexual assault training. I highly encourage you to, if you want to delve deeper, take a look at those. Stalking. So stalking's actually really common. Stalking comes in the Family Justice Center when a survivor comes in. They usually almost always start the conversation by saying, I know this sounds crazy, or I know this seems impossible, but. And what they usually then say is, I feel like I'm being tracked. I feel like somebody's able to watch my movements. I'm pretty sure that there is an app on my phone somehow that's tracking what I'm doing, where I'm going. So let's get into stalking definition. So it's a pattern of behavior directed at one specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I hate the definition of reasonable person. It's a legal definition. And the reason for that is because it doesn't necessarily mean that the person that is the recipient of that behavior is fearful. It's that if a group of reasonable individuals were to be told that of what's going on, they would say, yeah, that would put me in fear. I would feel fear for my safety if I experienced that. So it's a little bit of a legal definition, but that's the definition that we have to go with. Stalking in the United States data, about 1 in 3 women and about 1 in 6 men experience stalking. This can be through unwanted phone calls, somebody who shows up when there's no reason they should have showed up there, text messages, emails, gifts are sent, letters, things like that. I think the most common things that we see in the Family Justice Center are unwanted phone calls, unwanted texts. One of the ways that we tell people who are worried that they're being stalked, we say it's really important to switch your phone entirely. And that means you cannot bring over your old cloud into your new phone. It's manually entering everybody's phone number. You can't bring over what you had. If somebody's tracking your phone, we tell people to turn off their social media if they can. And definitely when they're going out to places, you know how people on Facebook or Instagram, if they go out to dinner or they're at a party or a festival or something, they tag themselves there. For stalking survivors, you cannot do that because then that tells somebody where you are, right? So that's one of the things that we recommend for survivors. What I would highly encourage folks to do is, this is the stalking awareness website. This is an amazing website with a lot of good information for both direct service providers that work with stalking survivors, as well as stalking survivors can look on these websites. The wonderful thing that they have on here, which I highly encourage you to look for, is what's called a stalking log. So typically what'll happen is law enforcement doesn't always like stalking. It's hard to prove. Again, it's kind of seems like situations that may or may not be possible. It usually involves technology in some way. None of those things are easy to define to a court or to a police officer. What we can do, though, is if somebody feels they're being stalked, we want them to write down every instance that happens, the time and date that it happened, what the incident was there anybody else present with you? Those logs, you don't have to create those. They can be found at this website. So I highly encourage you to go check that out. It's a great free resource that's available. Okay, we're going to transition into elder abuse. I hope you're bearing with me. I know this is a whole lot of information in a short period of time. Elder abuse is when someone commits on an elder or a dependent adult, and they willfully cause them or permit an elder or dependent adult to suffer physically or mentally. They commit a theft or fraud against that individual, or they falsely imprison that individual. So an elder in the state of California, an elder is defined as somebody over the age of 65. And that's who's able to file for an elder abuse restraining order. You have to be over the age of 65. A dependent adult is somebody between the ages of 18 and 64, and they do not control their own finances. They do not control, they are usually under a conservatorship of some kind. They don't get to make legal decisions or medical decisions on their own behalf. So they're grouped into when elder abuse takes place, just to let you all know that. This is the power and control wheel specifically for domestic violence. Oh, somebody's saying for APS in California, dependent adult is 1859. Thank you. That's very helpful. For the power and control wheel for elder abuse, it looks really similar to the power and control wheel that we saw a little bit ago in domestic violence. The thing that's different, though, is there's much more financial exploitation that happens in elder abuse, usually either by a caregiver or a family member. There's also isolation that occurs. There's also this concept of if that person is responsible for the care of an elder or dependent adult and they don't follow through on that, that can be abuse as well. So there's a little more to it than just the first power and control wheel that we saw, because there's that element of dependence on that caregiver that you have. In Contra Costa County, Adult Protective Services roughly receive around 865 elder abuse reports monthly. Again, the number's really, really high. It's really high. For Contra Costa County specifically, financial exploitation and self-neglect were the highest types of elder abuse that were coming into Adult Protective Services. This is the number of times they're seeing these instances within Contra Costa County. There's some physical and behavioral emotional signs of elder abuse that might be helpful for you to know. So, unusual weight loss, missing your medication, not having somebody attend to your medical needs, unsanitary living conditions. Emotional could be increased anxiety or fear, isolation from other family or friends, withdrawal from normal activities that you usually engage in. Oops, I usually have another slide here, but statistically, what we also know about elder abuse is if you are the victim of elder abuse, that impacts your health, your physical health, and it actually can lead to earlier death than somebody who has not experienced elder abuse because of the stress that's put against them, because they may not be getting the medication or health needs met that they need to be because that caregiver is not doing what they need to be doing to keep them safe. Okay. So self-neglect, somebody's asking about self-neglect. So self-neglect encompasses, you usually see it in like hoarding situations. Somebody who's not caring for themselves, they're not bathing, They may be really thin because they're not getting the adequate nutrients that they need. They're not eating as they should be. Things like that. You can report self-neglect to APS, you know, concern for an elderly neighbor. You haven't seen them in quite a while. You're not sure if they're getting out. They're not interacting with other individuals. But yeah, that's typically what we see when we see reports of self-neglect. So when we work with survivors, there's some risk factors that we want to look for. And we've gone over those again, but just to give an idea, for domestic violence, it's strangulation, being threatened that you're going to be killed or physically harmed in some way, increase in the frequency or severity of the abuse. In child abuse, it's if they're living with domestic violence within their home, we know that poverty plays a significant role in increasing child abuse. Children act out when they are experiencing abuse of some kind or seeing domestic violence within their home. You usually can see it's a child who needs additional support because they don't know how to process what they're experiencing, right? So that can come out in challenging behaviors. For human trafficking, the risk is increased if children and family services are involved. If there's been domestic violence in the home, it's more likely that you could be trafficked. You're more susceptible to it. And sexual assault, one of the things that I'm sure most of you know now, but a person causing harm by a current or intimate partner, that increases the likelihood of sexual assault. So it's usually somebody that is known to the survivor. This concept of not knowing who your assailant is. Usually about 66% of sexual assaults are committed by somebody that the survivor knew in some capacity. They may not have been dating or anything, but they knew them in some capacity. And obviously, whenever there's drug and alcohol use, that makes you more susceptible to being assaulted potentially because you may lack the capacity to consent to what's going on, right? The good thing is, and what we try and always look for with the survivors that we work with is that there are protective factors that folks have to keep them safe, right? So individually, it's looking at how are you able to be resilient against what you have experienced. So in looking at family, is there supportive family available, or do you have a community that can support you? Do you feel comfortable in going to therapy? Do you feel comfortable in doing yoga and something that allows you to process what has happened and begin to heal from it? You know, one of the contexts I always use is an LGBT youth that has been either kicked out by their family, which is abuse. They're going to have more resources here in California than necessarily in another state where the resources aren't as available to that survivor. So looking at the community as a whole and seeing what's available to you also is a protective factor that we try and look for when supporting survivors. This is survivors need a whole host of things. This is not a comprehensive list, but as you can see, there's several that survivors need in order to be able to be safe and in order to maintain, not only heal from their situation, but actually thrive again. You're going to need these things. So I'd always like to talk about why a Family Justice Center exists. Family Justice Centers we try and have them in as many counties as possible in California. And the reason for that is because, at least in Contra Costa, prior to having a Family Justice Center, this was the system that a survivor or victim would have to experience. So the onus would be on them to reach out to the resources. So say, for example, an instance happened the weekend before law enforcement was called out. Law enforcement said you really should get a restraining order. So Monday morning, that survivor drives to the courthouse, which is located in Martinez in our county. It's not very easily accessible by public transportation. So somebody would have to drive there, get the paperwork, fill it out, submit it. You have to go back in 24 hours, pick up the paperwork to see what your temporary one was. And then let's say when you're talking to the clerk, when you're picking up your paperwork, the clerk says, you really should reach out to the Domestic Violence Crisis Center for the county. Great. That's another phone call to call. They're based in Concord, which is not in Martinez. Again, another place you have to try and go to. And before you know it, we had all of these amazing resources that people weren't accessing because if you're in that trauma state, you're not going to do it, right? You're in survival mode. And so what ends up happening is they weren't getting connected to the resources that were available. Now compound that with somebody who English may not be their first language. They might have children that are so young that have to come with them because they can't go to school yet. So they're carting their kids around to the courthouse and then to, the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we wanted to do, at least in our county, was combat that. We wanted to put all the resources into one location so the survivor could get the resources that they needed in one spot, because it made it more likely they were going to get connected to the services and follow through than if they had to go to all of these different locations. So at our family justice centers, we have 3 in Contra Costa. We're actually opening a 4th very soon in our South County area. We also have our Solano Family Justice Center that we took over running in 2023. But each of these centers has roughly access to 70 partners that are on site, and they're able to get the resources to the survivor in that one location. So you can see there's a whole host, you have housing support, legal support, mental health support. And what we want those to lead to in getting connected to those resources is having health, community, wealth, and education and training. If you have those 4 things, our tenet is you are more likely to thrive and heal from what has happened. And we stay with clients both in the short-term crisis and in the long term, because we want to connect them to resources available that help promote wealth, education, training, community. We have parenting classes, we have community groups that happen here. We want to make sure that in the long term that they are thriving. A little bit about some of the programs that we have. If you're interested in referring a client or a survivor to the Family Justice Center, we have 6 mental health programs that we coordinate. You don't have to know all these. The important thing for you to know is it does not bill towards insurance of any kind. Isn't that amazing? We have all of this access to mental health support. If somebody's interested in it, it doesn't matter if they have insurance or not. They don't need it for any of these programs. And as you can see, we run ages 6 to 106. We try and have a wide variety of resources that are available to folks to get them the support that they're needing if they're interested in counseling. We also have a telehealth program that I think is really important to share with folks. The main thing about this, you're going to hear it, right? It doesn't bill to insurance. So somebody's actually able to have a telehealth appointment on their phone or on their iPad with an ER trained doctor. It doesn't matter what insurance they have or if they have it or not. They're able to talk to that doctor. And the way the person can get connected to either the mental health support, the telecare support, is through calling one of our family justice centers and talking with one of our navigators. They're able to book those appointments for clients. We don't have a waiting list for adult mental health support right now. And you usually can get the person in the same week for a telehealth appointment. So just to keep that in mind, the telehealth appointment does not need to be related to the abuse experienced. It can be that you are a survivor of some type of abuse and you also have a cold that week and you haven't been able to get into your primary care physician and you want to talk to somebody to get medication or whatever. That is a perfectly good appointment for us to schedule and for somebody to call asking for support with. Okay, so we're ending a little early. You're going to get about 20 minutes back in your day, which is fantastic. I want to be able to take questions if folks have them. But the main things that I want to tell you is there's almost 100 people on this workshop today, which is phenomenal. I'm asking you to do something when you leave this workshop. The one or two things that I want you to do are tell 3 friends or colleagues about the Family Justice Center and about this training. And the reason for that, I'm going to give you a very short story. The reason for that is because one of our behavioral health clinicians through the county came to our specific human trafficking training. And she sat through that training years ago. And then a couple years later, we've stayed in contact. She's, she refers clients all the time. She reached out to me and she said, I think I've identified a patient that's being trafficked. And she said it was because of the training she had sat through that she was able to make that identification, which is the most rewarding thing as a trainer that I can hear, to be totally honest. So of the information that you've taken in, you're not going to remember it all. I completely get that. But if you, from this training, are then interacting with somebody that is going through one of these situations, you now know how to identify it, and you now know where to send them to get some help. And isn't that an incredible thing? And I will never be able to reach the number of people all 95 of you were able to reach. I also really encourage you to visit our website. We have a newsletter, which I'm sure the majority of you are already on, that talks about other trainings we're going to be providing. They're totally free. It talks about any upcoming events. We're opening a South County Center in Danville in a couple months. So we're going to be having a grand opening for that. I'd love for you all to attend. But I want to be able to take the time to share my contact information with you if you have any follow-up questions. I remember we had a couple folks from Stanislaus County that followed up with me a couple times around tricky restraining order situations. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm around. I want to be able to be that help, even if you're not within Contra Costa County. We want to be able to support each other. A question that came through the chat specifically said, does your agency offer training for peer counselors and to be advocates? We don't directly, however, we work with an organization that does. So if they're wanting the domestic violence 40-hour training, we work with an organization called Stand for Families Free of Violence. They're able to provide that training. And then we also work, if you're interested in having an advocate for a sexual assault certified advocate, we work with an organization called Community Violence Solutions that provides those trainings as well. And I'm happy to make those connections for you if that's something you're interested in. I have a couple questions from folks that are raising their hands. So if you want to put those in the chat, or I can actually make you a panelist. Sarah, I'm going to have you go first. And hopefully this will work. Oh, maybe it won't work. Sarah, do you want to put your information in the chat? We're going to allow you to talk. There we go. Sarah, did you have a question? Nope. Okay. I'm going to put you back in. Okay. Let's see. Next one. Zareen, did you have a question?
No, I don't. I was just raising my hand earlier.
Earlier. Got it. Okay. Just checking.
Sorry.
Yes, and I can send out the information for the certified advocate trainings. We can include that when we send out the slides. All right, thank you all so much for being here and for sitting through this. We really appreciate your time. You're going to be getting a survey. I know you get surveys all the time, post trainings. I look at those. If there's things that you're like, oh, you really need to change the way you do this, I want to know that so that I can improve on the trainings moving forward. So please, it takes about like 1 minute of your time to fill it out. It's only 5 questions. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a great Friday. And we'll talk to you all soon.